And they've got prime minister level committees and cabinet committees and all their business communities focusing on what are they going to do to compete in the future, because they're scared to death of the challenge being posed by India, by China, by much of the rest of the developing world. And the question is, what are we going to do? And everybody, in a way, comes up with the same answer. Everybody is saying we have to become more innovative. We have to have better education. Ireland just announced it's going to double the number of PhDs that will be graduated in the next 15 years. We have to have more startups, better coordination between the universities and the industries and the government and so forth. And many countries are focusing on industries, and they're all the same industries. It's biotech, it's nanotech, it's IT, often it's tourism, but everybody is kind of focusing on the same issue. And so I think that however that question gets resolved, and I think ultimately every country will resolve that question in its own way and in many different ways, but it gets to a point that Minister Nath, I think, made very importantly. And that is, what is the structure of globalization going to be in the future? Because if you are in a situation where you're concerned about your competitiveness, or if you're in a situation in which you are making great progress and you're very aggressively attacking world markets, it's important for you to have those world markets open. But in the context in which many countries are concerned about their competitiveness, the potential for some kind of protectionist reaction, the potential for a world that's not flat, is very significant. And in fact, as Minister Nath alluded to in his comments, the world is much less flat than maybe we have been admitting in many of these discussions that we have. The obvious bumps in the sectors of agriculture and many of the service sectors are well known and have been well discussed. But I want to turn to something that I think is in a way much more significant and much more dangerous, that I think is not well enough understood. And that's the following. When I go to meetings like this and we talk about the flat world, my comment is that, yes, I agree with Tom, the world is flat. It was a great book title, and it's a good way to capture what's happening in the global economy. I just add one more thing. It's tilted. And what I mean by that is that if you look at the structure of the global economy, there is essentially one major center of consumption, and that, of course, is the United States. And all of the other major centers of economic activity, Japan, the EU, China, and others, are net producers and big net sellers. So we live in a world in which essentially, I'm simplifying here, but essentially the role of the United States has become to be the buyer of last resort. And in fact, this has personal as well as general significance, because frequently when I go on trips like this, I bring my wife, and she says, "Oh, how's the shopping in India?" And I say, "Great." And she says, "Ah, fantastic." And I say, "Well, let's try to hold it down." And she says, No. She says, "I have to support the global economy." And so that's what, in effect, the job of the U.S. is. And as you all know, the U.S. right now is consuming far more than it produces. Americans are spending more than they earn, consuming more than they produce. And so the job, essentially, of the Americans in the global economy today is to spend and borrow. Because the only way you can consume more than you produce is by borrowing. And that's what we do. And we borrow primarily from China, Japan, and OPEC, to the tune of about $3 billion every single working day, net necessary capital inflow into the U.S. And the job of the rest of the world, but particularly of East Asia, and I emphasize East Asia, not South Asia, East Asia. It's Japan, it's Korea, it's Taiwan, it's Singapore, it's China, East Asia. What they have developed is a developmental model which focuses on saving, production, export-led growth, and currency management. Now, many of you have read recently about the various trips of Secretary Paulson, the U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, to China to try to pressure the Chinese to allow the yuan to float up a bit higher, or to revalue the yuan. And those are significant trips, but I think what much of the discussion misses is that it's not just China that is managing its currency, it's all of the other countries that I mentioned. And all of that management is being done with the objective of stimulating exports and of accumulating current account surpluses. I want to emphasize this is not the case of India. This is not the case of India, but it is the case of much of East Asia. There's a second element that exists in the current structure of the global economy. Recently, Intel announced that they're putting a big factory in Israel. In fact, the factory is going to go into a part of Israel that has been contended with terrorist attacks. And the question it obviously arises is, why is that factory going there? Or, take another example. Recently, Novartis announced a big factory in Singapore. And you say, why is that factory going there? These two locations, we're operating the global economy. The whole fundamental basis of the World Trade Organization is the theory of free trade and comparative advantage. And so under that theory, countries have a comparative advantage in production of something, and they produce what they're best at, and they export that, and they import from others what they don't do so well. And everybody does what's best, and they trade, and global welfare is supposed to be maximized. But what you frequently see is situations in which industries in which the comparative advantage, the classic comparative advantage, is thought to be in the U.S. or in Japan or someplace. And then you see that a huge investment in that industry is made someplace else. And you scratch your head. You say, that's not the way it's supposed to work. What's happening? And what's happening are tax holidays and capital grants. So that if you're a big high-tech manufacturer today and you need to expand your production, essentially you shop and you go to Ireland or to Singapore or China or lots of places. And I'm not trying to identify particular countries because many, many countries do this, including the states of the United States. But you shop to get the best tax deal or to see who will give you the most capital upfront money in order to build that factory. And this is a very, very understandable kind of policy on the part of governments, be they national or local. But it is a huge trade distortion and ultimately results in a very, very bizarre pattern of global production and global trade, which has the ultimate impact of creating a situation which appears to be unfair. And when the global situation appears to be unfair, you can bet that there is going to be a political reaction. So one of the points I would like to make this morning is that as we look at the tremendous benefits that globalization is generating right now, today, think about how sustainable the current situation is. Will the Americans be able indefinitely to consume more than they produce? Will the Chinese and the Japanese and OPEC indefinitely buy American treasury bonds to finance their exports to the U.S.? Will the dollar remain the world's currency? Will oil be priced in dollars in 10 years? Will semiconductors be sold in dollars in 10 years? Is this sustainable? Nobody knows the answer to this, but I suggest that it's something that those of us who are benefiting from and promoting globalization should be addressing. I'm reminded of a story I heard once about a climber in California. You know, they have these people who climb up vertical rock walls. That they put chalk on their hands and they climb up these vertical rocks. Now, I've tried it, and I must have the wrong chalk because it doesn't stick. But anyhow, one of these guys was climbing El Capitan in Yosemite National Park, and he was just about to put his hand over the top when he slipped. And he's falling and he's flailing around trying to grab something to hold on to. And at the last moment, he grabs a protruding branch by one hand. And he's hanging onto this branch, kind of bouncing up and down. And he knows he can't hang on too long. And so he's not a very religious person, but this is really a serious moment. It's 1,000 feet, you know, right down into the rocks in the water. And so he looks up at the sky, and he says, "Is there anybody up there?" And to his utter amazement, this big voice booms out. He says, "Yeah, what do you want?" And the guy says, "What I do?" And the voice says, "Jump, of course." And he looks down, and it's 1,000 feet into the rocks in the water. He looks back up, he says, "Is there anybody else up there?" We need somebody else. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Prestowitz, for those very, very good remarks, including your personal encounters with the flat or tilted world. You talked a lot about the sustainability of globalization, and I would like to pick up that topic with a question first to the Minister, whilst the rest of you think about your questions. And the question I would ask is this. You also talked about the very important need to include large chunks of population, especially those involved in rural areas and agriculture. And yet at the same time, the voices we hear is that the developed world, and the US in particular, is very unlikely to flatten the agricultural produce subsidy level, etc. How do you think you would cope with that situation in a country like India with so much of our population dependent on agriculture?
Well, one of the greatest, when I was talking about structural flaws, one of the greatest structural flaws in world trade is agriculture. And the flaw in agriculture is the huge subsidies given by the European Union and the United States, amounting to almost $1 billion a day. Just the United States has subsidies of about $75 billion to agriculture. That not only distorts prices, but when those subsidies seek market access, as I was saying, that if 45% of cotton is US subsidy on the price of US cotton, what does the farmer in Africa do? For India, it's fine. We import about $500 million of cotton. So we can continue importing subsidized cotton, convert it to yarn and garments, and sell it back to the United States. But at the same time, there is the subsidized the wheat, the rice, the maize, the oil, the soya, etc. And the United States does have a political problem. After all, there is just 2%. I think there is about 150,000 US farmers versus 650 million people engaged here. So it is a very contentious issue in the WTO. On the other hand, the European subsidies distort prices. But Europe is not an offensive exporter. So we are up against that. And this round, the Doha round, doesn't intend to eliminate subsidies, but seeks to substantially reduce these subsidies. Well, unless that happens, this impasse will continue, because in India, certainly we cannot import subsidized products which dislocate farmers, because it's not trade flows, it will be subsidy flows. And it's argued is good for the consumer, as much as it's argued that buying very cheap stuff in the United States is very good for the U.S. consumer. Year before last, when the multi-fiber agreement was over in textiles, we all read in the newspapers how China flooded Europe with lingerie, and there was more lingerie for women than there were women in the whole of Europe. But so they put an embargo, and when this embargo was put, it was lifted by the European Union because the retail industry there had a great lobby, and they said, what will happen to our shops? Who's going to fill our shelves? We want these Chinese. We want this Chinese lingerie. Consumer or no consumer, we'll find the consumer. Let the European Union let it go. And the European Union had to then allow the import of that. So there are two sides to it. But coming back to your question, it's very clear that we do need to find a solution, and the United States has to move forward in reducing its subsidies, not optically, but how much subsidy is there going to be less from the U.S. Treasury, because we find the Indian farmer not competing as the U.S. farmer, he's competing as the U.S. Treasury.
Thank you. Let me ask Mr. Prestowitz a question, and then we'll throw it open to the House. You talked about the U.S. being in the throes of almost unstoppable consumption, and that's absolutely true. You only have to visit the shopping malls there to see that. But that consumption is also putting a huge load on the sustainability of the planet. And yet the most powerful nation in the world is unwilling to sign the Kyoto Protocol. At the same time, they call for everyone else to curb their energy demands. How do you think this will play itself out?
Very good point. And I think there's another element to it, though, which is in a way even more daunting and challenging. It's true that the U.S., with about 5% of global population, accounts for about 33% of global consumption. And the U.S. is the world's biggest emitter of greenhouse gases, biggest user of raw materials, and so forth. And so you can look at that and rightly, justly, question the profligacy of these Americans, and also point at the hypocrisy of these Americans who preach to everyone else but don't practice what they preach. But having done all that, you're still left with the following problem. No one in the world is asking the Americans to consume less, because everybody wants to sell to the Americans. The global economy is structured in such a way that the growth of China and India and the recovery of Japan and the recovery of Germany and some of the languishing European economies is all export-led. And the center, the only net buyer in the world, is the U.S. It's not quite true. The U.K. is a net buyer, a small one. But the only major net buyer in the world is the U.S. So I think the solution to the conundrum that you raise is, in fact, a global solution. If the Americans said, you're right, you're absolutely right, we've been hypocritical, we've been profligate, and we're going to change our ways. And we're going to cut consumption and begin running surpluses. If the rest of the world did nothing, we'd be in a global financial crisis, a global recession. So the only way this works is if there's a deal, and the deal is that the Americans begin to get their budget and their savings accounts under control at the same time that the rest of the world, and this means basically Japan and China and the EU, begin to invest less, save less, and spend more. And let's look at what we're talking about. I was in Singapore recently and met with a former senior official in Singapore. And I said to him, you know, Mr. Minister, Singapore has $300 billion of reserves for 4 million people. Those are official reserves. Unofficial reserves are about double that. I said Singapore has had a trade surplus, a current account surplus every year for the past 35 years. It runs a big, huge budget surplus. Savings rate in Singapore is over 50% of GDP. I said, does Singapore have to have a current account surplus every year? And the answer wasn't just yes, it was yes! Very emphatically yes. Well, the problem is that if everybody in East Asia thinks they have to have a current account surplus, somebody has to buy. And that's what the Americans do. So for this to get fixed, it's a two-way street.
Yes, of course. But perhaps there could be one additional solution, which could be based on the principle that industry generally follows money. And perhaps the US government and other governments could use fiscal instruments like high taxation to disincentivize gas guzzlers and subsidies to promote hybrid cars. But perhaps this may be a good moment to turn to the House and ask for questions from the audience. Are there any questions? Yes, sir.
Good afternoon. I'm Vineet Chaudhary. Here today on this forum, we are talking of free trade. And my question is to the respected minister. While you have been road showing India all across the world with the spirit of exporting from India, here back home, the government industry, which is the public sector, is, I would say, until this day, closed to imports. What is your opinion on this?
Well, India is not merely an exporter. That was in 91 when we were looking for generating foreign exchange. Today, with our huge reserves of foreign exchange, India is a major importer. And if we look at statistics, and even the statistics with the United States, our imports are going up at the rate of 35%. And our imports are between our imports are going up by 35%. And our exports are going up by 20-25%. India is today a very big importer. And when you say the public sector is not importing, I really do not get in what context you're saying that, but public sector today, there is no prohibition on the public sector. It's again competitiveness. In fact, we are grappling with the situation where the manufacturing industries in India are saying that you are making it difficult for us to sell in India. We much rather, when there's a global tender, and this is of a public sector corporation, they said when they import, it's cheaper to them. When we, in India, when a public sector company is to buy from India, they're finding that it's more expensive because of the Indian taxes, because of the transactional costs, because of levies at even a state government level, which are not refunded to them. And when they're importing, so they said it's better for us. This is a classic case on which we are doing a study where manufacturers in India say it's better to export to Sri Lanka and from Sri Lanka to import it back to India. We'll find ourselves more competitive that way. So there is no embargo on public sector imports. And gradually, as we brought our tariffs down in the last budget, a fortnight ago approximately, we brought down our peak rates of tariffs from 10%. And if we look at capital goods, our tariff structure today is 5, 7.5, and 10, except in certain areas, in textiles, in automobiles, and in things like wines and spirits. Our tariffs are high. But otherwise, across the board, with low tariffs, again, it's a question of competitiveness. If competitiveness, we are seeing this great problem in investment also, where India is competing for investment with Vietnam, as Mr. Prestowitz said, that now with capital grants, with tax breaks for setting up industry in other countries in East Asia. In India, we are not doing what Vietnam is doing. In India, we're not doing what, say, Cambodia is doing, what Philippines is doing, what Indonesia is doing. In incentivizing incentive, it's a big challenge for us to grapple with it. At the same time, competitiveness is now dictating where you will buy from.
Would you like to add something?
Yeah,
I think you want to follow that up.
You have addressed this issue from the import-export policy and strategy point of view. But reality grassroots is, if you look at, I would say 50% of the global tenders, they say companies from international community who have been supplying in the past to X, Y, Z, which is Indian public sector undertakings, when you put such a pre-qualification condition, really speaking, no new entrant can enter that system.
You're talking about price preference which is given. Is
No,
that?
not price, not even price, okay.
In qualification.
In pre-qualification. If, for example, I name Coal India, tender after tender, they will say in pre-qualification, if you have supplied to Coal India, SECL, NCL, or other Government of India coal subsidiaries, only then you pre-qualify. Otherwise, you don't qualify, which means they really block you to enter. It's the mindset of our public sector.
Well, that's the biggest problem we have. You can change your laws. Sometimes you can change your constitution. How do we change mindsets? I'm not saying that lightheartedly. In fact, that's one of the most. How do you change attitudes? When we talk of reforms, when we talk of everything, of change, the most difficult thing to change becomes attitude. When people come to me and they say, you said this in your policy, but then when we go to that officer, he says, okay, policy is there. I must tell you what happened when we computerized. When we computerized import and export and put it on the net, it's all IT connected. So somebody was saying that why have it IT connected? Because the customs officer tells us that, listen, this is all very well, but I need to see the face of that importer. Until I see his face, what will this net do, And again, it's attitude. So I think that attitudinal change is taking place. All I can say is that, and in the specific thing of coal, I can only tell you I'll have a look at that, why it is so, and there must be some rationale in it. Is it because they have this inhibition of import, or they have this inhibition about something or the other, which I can't tell you right now.
Would you like to add to that?
Underline a point that Minister Nath made, which is that the structure of Indian trade and the profile of India's accounts is entirely different from those of East Asia. India is not running a trade policy aimed at accumulating current account surpluses. And I don't know about the specifics of openness in particular industries, but generally speaking, India presents the profile of a pretty much market-driven open economy. I do believe that India is being disadvantaged by the policies of East Asia. I believe that the currency management of East Asia and the investment incentives that are being offered by many countries around the world are to the detriment of India.
I would really add to that very briefly by saying that currency calibration is what when he said that Hank Paulson has gone around. I fully back Hank Paulson in getting China to reform its currency calibration, which they do, because your competitiveness is driven by currency calibration, which is being done very largely by China. And as Mr. Prestowitz said, that it's India's growth is domestic market driven. China's growth is export market driven.
Yes, sir. There's a question there. Do you want to take a mic, actually? Oh. Come back to you.
Yeah, I am Ravindra Agrawal. My question is to Mr. Prestowitz. He just said that US is consuming more and producing less. That's why they are net consumers. As a result, the world should think in those manner that they are the net consumers. Well, sir, let me know whether this consumption is competitiveness driven. Is it not more profitable for US to produce less and consume from outside world, because then they can have that resources available for their technological driven growth? As in India, we are also net importers and we are having less exports, but it is for our GDP growth and for the growth of the economy. How you say this, that just because America is a net consumer, the world should think in those terms, otherwise the consumption will reduce?
Good question. Two quick responses. One is that an economy needs consumers and producers. If you can't have an economy that's all production and no consumption, or all consumption is no production. So you got to have both. The difficulty I see in the world economy today is that there's kind of a lack of consumers. The U.S. is a net consumer, India is a net consumer, but there are not enough net consumers in the world. Now, you make the point that, okay, but this could be profitable, and in that regard, I think there's a big difference, actually, between India and the U.S. India is running a current account deficit and covering that with inflow of capital or domestic savings, and investing in new productive facilities which will enhance productivity in the future. In the U.S., there are no savings. We are financing our consumption by importing foreign capital, which is not being invested in productive facilities. So effectively, Americans are mortgaging their future, or the future of their children. And we've seen just in the last couple of weeks a little scare when the Shanghai market fell, unraveling of the carry trade from Japan. All of these send shivers through the world economy, because what the Americans are doing is not sustainable.
One last question, Mr. Kampani.
My question is that United States of America is having more borrowing today. Like an individual, if he borrows more, he can become bankrupt. Same happens to corporate. If he borrows substantially more, they can go for bankruptcy. And US also is doing the same at the moment. What happens now if East Asia doesn't politically support United States of America and they continue to manage their currency? It may so happen that ultimately dollar will get devalued. And if dollar gets devalued, I think India, which is very open and transparent, might suffer, because then our exports will suffer in India and there could be imbalance in the world. Where do you see this imbalance if politically, as United States, manages politically everything in the world, is not able to manage China, Japan, Korea? What will happen? Will there be imbalance in the world?
Yes. 2 points. One is Paul Volcker, the former chairman of the U.S. Federal Reserve, made a statement recently in which he predicted a 75% chance of a global financial crisis within the next 4 years. I believe that the dollar will devalue by between 50 and 70% on a trade-weighted basis sometime within the next 5 to 7 years. I don't know exactly what the timing is, but I believe that there has to be a big dollar devaluation, and I can already see a move away from the dollar. Many smaller central banks are limiting their dollar reserves and moving into euros or Canadian dollars or other assets. China, as you know, is putting together an investment fund in order to begin investing its reserves in something other than U.S. treasuries. There's already an understanding that just buying U.S. treasuries is not a good path for the future. And all of that suggests to me an eventual move away from the dollar.
Thank you. I think I'd like to bring this to a conclusion. We are out of time, really. And just say one thing, which is that I began in my introduction to say that we should learn the lessons of history. It's clear just from the richness of this discussion and this debate and this thought that we are obviously well on our way to averting the problems that happened several years ago. I think we have several thoughts in place, and most importantly, if a debate like this carries on, we will surely find the way to make the world truly flat, or indeed to remove the tilt, as you said earlier. With that, let me thank our panelists, Minister Kamal Nath, Mr. Prestowitz, for your very open and thoughtful deliberations, and also Mr. Arun Puri for, of course, organizing this function. Thank you.
May I request Mr. Arun Puri to kindly give away the mementos. Thank you very much.